So we are blessed to have with us Marionette Pember. She is an independent journalist focusing on Native issues. In her writing and her photography, she has covered subjects including high rates of sexual assault against Native women, sex trafficking, health, impact of historical trauma in Native communities, environmental challenges on Native lands, policy issues, and cultural and spiritual topics. She's the past president and executive director of the Native American Journalists Association, has won many awards and fellowships, and she's also an enrolled citizen of the Red Cliff Band of the Wisconsin Ojibwe. So please welcome Marionette Pember.
Oh, bonjour, Anim. Baba Manaquad, Indigenous Kaz, Mong and Dudem. I'm enrolled Red Cliff, but all my relatives are from Bad River. My mother grew up at Bad River. I wonder if we could dim the lights just a little bit. This is a little bit triggering, and I just want to make sure people know that. Young sister here, Courtney, and Danita. I bought a little smudge medicine. If folks feel they need it, please ask for it, and we're delighted to share it with you. So this is an excerpt from a memoir I'm writing about my family. And the name of it is Blood Medicine. Awabanook, 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 Awabanook. Awabanook, Awabanook. Oh, I know something else. Research, journalistic investigation, epigenetics of historical trauma. These are the white man's tidy explanations, the carefully crafted epistemologies I sacrificed to the altar of all her secret wounds. But they refused to burn. They had changed into spirits. Manidug, inured to the fire of reason. I don't remember a time when I didn't know about the trauma my mother and relatives endured at the sister school. It was there that the sisters of perpetual adoration dedicated themselves to scrubbing the dirty Indian children clean, 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 enough to become servants of God and the white man, their model and savior. At the sister school, they were fed a steady diet of degradation, washed down with the gospel of inferiority. The cheap white man's food had no medicine. It starved both the body and spirit. I've written many articles trying to explain the Indian boarding school experience and how its poison spilled over onto survivors' families. I thought my role as a journalist would protect me from my own family's trauma. I fancied that knowledge alone would take away our pain. I was wrong. I have to tell my family's story not as a journalist, but as a Anishinaabe. My family's trauma began life as a Manitou, the one we call Wendigo. The literal English translation for the word is cannibal, but that Manitou, like most Ojibwe spirituality, is far more nuanced than such an artless definition. The Wendigo, I've been told, is like a virus, infecting its host with a depraved, insatiable hunger that leads the sufferer to feast on human flesh, and at last, in desperation, to devour even herself. Like a vampire or zombie in a modern-day TV show, the Wendigo passes itself and its catastrophic hunger forward from one generation to the next. Our family's Wendigo was an amalgamation of my mother's horrible, unspeakable secrets. She worked hard to keep that Manitou at bay. Sometimes it would pursue her, trying to take over her mind. She would walk the floor, sometimes for hours, desperately shaking her head from side to side to keep the Wendigo from entering. She would flap and wring her hands over and over again, as though to rid them of a clinging presence. She was lost to us during those times. Eventually, she would wind herself down. Sometimes even laughing a bit in relief, she'd mutter, "Settle down, you crazy old chicken," before collapsing under her bed. That spirit and its awful doings cut her mind. I think she believed she would break into a million pieces if she recalled those amygdala events that held her hostage. So I remember them for her. I uncover the secret identity of that clinging presence, and in the process, I file down that monster's teeth so that although it can still deliver a sharp bite, it can't cut into us anymore. The only way is ceremony, that naked, wordless action of the heart. It's the only way we've ever had. I offer my asema, tobacco, and I begin. All the United States Catholic Indian boarding school records are stored in the Special Collections Library at Marquette Catholic University in Milwaukee. Carefully preserved and tended, they lie in climate-controlled archival luxury. I made a special appointment with the archivist weeks in advance in order to examine them. I arrived on campus at the university on a hot summer day. The manicured buildings and grounds of the school brought back memories of my own regimented days at Catholic school. I walked across campus to the library. I welcomed the chilly air of the building after my long hike in the hot sun. More like a high-security bank than the library, the building's interior featured several state-of-the-art checkpoints at which I had to show my identification and provide the name of the person I was visiting. At last, I made my way to a cavernous room located in the deepest reaches of the library where the Indian boarding school documents were kept. The receptionist eyed me suspiciously. The archivist had been called away, she told me, and would not be able to keep our appointment. He had, however, left a card of documents for me to review. I was allowed to bring in only my purse and given white cotton archivist's gloves to wear while I handled the documents. I was the sole visitor in the huge reading room. Although severe and spare, the room and its furnishings were made of the finest materials. The simple wooden study tables and chairs shone with a rich patina. I felt very small as I sat at one of the enormous tables and opened the first of many boxes. To my great disappointment, they contained multi-generational photocopies of lists of names of students at the various Catholic boarding schools that once dotted Indian country. Eventually, I found the names of my mother and her siblings. The ink faded, written in that careful Catholic cursive penmanship that I knew all too well from my days at Catholic school. As a youngster, I labored terribly over my handwriting, never meeting the standards of the nuns at St. Patrick's School. I sat back heavily in my chair and breathed an exasperated sigh. I thought to myself, I've come all this way for nothing. The room was chilly and I trembled a bit, wishing I'd brought a sweater. I gazed up at the large oil portraits of notable Jesuit priests hung on the walls. Each was surrounded by a heavy, elaborately carved wooden frame. I imagined they smiled down a little smugly at me from their impervious heights. Their expressions exuded an air of disdain. Suddenly, the archivist arrived, a bit out of breath. Apologizing for his lateness, he explained that even the original collection held very little personal information about any of the students who attended the school so long ago. The collection of original documents, he noted, was largely administrative, but I could view them if I liked. I'd come this far, so I said yes. He brought in another cartload of cardboard file boxes. Beyond the listing of student names and check marks in columns indicated if they'd graduated, run away, or died. Mostly bureaucratic reports and correspondence between generations of mission school principals and the Office of the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions in Washington, D.C. The agency oversaw and dispersed both church funds as well as federal monies from Indian treaty funds to various mission schools. At last, I found an envelope of photos that had been published in the Indian Sentinel, a fundraising magazine created by the Jesuits. Remarkably, every photo that appeared in the magazine, first published in the 1880s and discontinued in 1973, were preserved in the files. There were photos of crowds of Indian kids from the 30s, during my mother's era. The children wore identical haircuts and shabby uniforms. Was my mother among this nameless crowd, I wondered? Most of the student photos included wealthy donors. During their visits to the school, only the donors were identified by name. Like photographers' props, the children looked grimly into the camera lens. I remember my mother spitting on her resentment at those white donors who would cry and fuss over the students. How she hated being paraded before them by the nuns. I looked at a photo of a well-dressed white lady smiling her wide, sanctimonious smile at a group of somber-faced Indian kids, and I found myself hating her. These bits of Catholic charity left me weary and ashamed. I leafed through a stack of yellowed papers. Reading them was slow going while wearing those bulky white gloves. My mind began to wander to past summers spent with my mother. Her migraines held me prisoner in those days. It's summer and the air is torpid and hot. Our little house, however, is dark and cool, shaded by elms, ringed with gardens of shade-loving lilies of the valley, her flower. I'm around 4 years old. We're alone in the house. I sit next to my wiener dog, Hansi, on the kitchen floor and try to think of what to do. Above all, I have to be quiet. Hansi's long black toenails clicks as he walks across the floor. Be quiet, Mama doesn't feel good. I hiss at him. He sits down again, his brows knit in embarrassment. He keeps watch with me. Carefully, I find my stool and use it to reach the kitchen countertop. I make her toast. I find the bottle of Anacin and fill a glass with water. I'm very careful. I bring it all into her dark bedroom without spilling anything. I place my offerings on the little table next to her bed. Silently, I climb up on the back of the sofa and gather up all her glass and porcelain figurines and retreat deep into the forest of wooden legs under the dining room table. I carefully line up the elf, the Santa, the girl in the pink hoop skirt, and the dear mother with her twin fawns forever attached to her throat by a golden chain. The twin fawns are badly chipped, banging into each other as they play and tug at the chain. The dear mother's face is expressionless as she tells them, Gaween, stop. I whisper detailed instructions to the figures. My furtive little girl ceremony works. It's a medicine because after a while she calls to me, Mary. I find her lying in the dark on the white nubby cotton bedspread with one arm thrown over her eyes. The other arm is open for me. Silently, I climb onto the bed, fitting myself into her armpit and gaze into the cleft of her breasts where the tiny blue Virgin Mary medal lives pinned to her brassiere. The bedspread is stiff from its time drying outside on the clothesline, but smells of fresh air and of her. She spends hours washing the laundry, white to white, like the sisters taught her, rushing up and down the cellar steps with baskets of those heavy, wet sheets. We may be Indian, but by God, we ain't dirty, she mutters, while hanging sheets on the line, regardless of the season. Her deep voice wraps a cocoon around us in the dark bedroom. Once again, as she has hundreds of times, she tells me of the evil Sister Catherine. She travels the well-worn path of her Sister Catherine's stories. I snuggle closer to her, shivering a bit in anticipation of Sister Catherine's cruelty. I smile and wait for her delicious comeuppance. Mother Superior Sister Catherine of the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration Order was the principal of St. Mary's Indian Boarding School on the Ojibwe Bad River Reservation in Odena, Wisconsin. Harsh and cruel, she ruled her little kingdom of Ojibwe children with an iron hand. We were always hungry, my mother said. Sister Catherine beat her viciously for stealing an apple from the cellar where the nuns stored food for themselves and the students. Hunger was a constant theme of those stories in which a stolen apple or a gulp of cream from the milking parlor earned a brutal beating. Although she knew she'd be punished, my mother couldn't resist that beautiful apple. For years, she savored its taste and the retelling of her beating that she endured, refusing to shed a tear. But it was Sister's words that cut deeper than any strap. Indian was always preceded by the word dirty. The ancestral dirt of Indianness was a curse that stood between the children and God. That curse lingered in my mother's ears, immune to her lifetime of obsessive scrubbing and cleaning. The mood of her story lifts, and her voice takes on the wicked conspiratorial tone I love so well. My hands tingle as I await the delightful denouement. One year, during the Christmas season, a sister was marching down the cellar steps to check if we stole any food. She fell on the bottom step. Crash. She hit her head bad. Not long after, she died. What a silent cheer us kids made. Maybe it was terrible, but it was the best Christmas present we ever got. She clasped her little hands together. In a few moments, we share a little girl's wicked delight. My mother told many stories like this from her sister's school days and her life on the res. As an adult, I learned those tales were sanitized versions of reality in which good always triumphed over evil. Like prayers, she chanted them over and over again. Without them, she would have surely broken into a million pieces. Our family's job was to listen and never question. Dutifully, we kept the leaky dike of her sanity and the uneasy balance of our family in place. Sometimes filthy water would lap over her barrier and she would pace the house, shaking her head as though to rid her ears of an obstruction. She would flap her hands as she moved, trying to shake off that clinging presence. At last, after many Camel cigarettes and cups of black coffee at our gray Formica kitchen table, she would regain her footing and return to her relentless cleaning. I sat under the table in those times. My stomach muscles tensed. I drew secret symbols with my black crayon on the table's underside. Sometimes my medicine worked, and she would return to herself. Emerging from my reverie, I returned my attention to the archival boxes and the stacks of yellow paper. The subjects of the letters were mind-numbingly dull, a back and forth between school principals and the office in Washington, D.C., about details of reports and requests for more forms. Perhaps I should call it a day, I thought. Shivering from a sudden blast of frigid air, I wondered again why it was so cold in there. The icy room was silent, except for the occasional thud of muffled footsteps from other rooms in that vast building. Aside from the receptionist, I was the only person in the reading room. Yet I distinctly heard someone whisper my name, Mary. I looked at the receptionist. She was gazing placidly at her computer terminal. The whisper brought me up short. It sounded like my mother's voice. There was a note of warning that reminded me vividly of my childhood. Get down on those prayer bones, girl, she'd demand when I scrubbed the floor. I returned to my work, carefully sorting through the documents until I found those relating to St. Mary's School in Odena. I found a yellow typewritten letter dated January 3rd, 1934. It was addressed to the Right Reverend Monsignor William Hughes, Director of the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions in Washington, D.C., from Sister Mary Macaria, the Sister Secretary at St. Mary's Indian School. It read in part, by the time these lines reach you, our dear Mother Superior, Sister Catherine, will, no doubt, have been called to her eternal reward. On December 19th, she fell off the second last step leading down to the kitchen entry. She must have pitched forward with great force, for in striking her head against a windowsill, a gash was cut in her forehead by the temple of her glasses. On Friday, December 29th, the sister nurse noticed a change in sister's condition and told us she feared a stroke. Our dear sister had convulsions, was anointed, and has been speechless since. The doctor says it can hardly be but a matter of a day or so, at most if she does linger, even that long. We know you will pray earnestly for her eternal repose and for a speedy relief from her sufferings. Sorrowfully yours in the agonizing heart of Jesus. It was signed Sister Macaria. When I got to the end of the letter, I involuntarily stood straight up out of my chair. I stared at the shocked receptionist with my mouth wide open for several moments. The poor woman looked worried and seemed to consider calling for help. I sat down again and concentrated on the contents of the box. Warily, the receptionist returned her attention to her computer work. To my amazement, I found an original photo of Sister Catherine. Covered from head to toe in her black and white nun's habit, she gazed sternly at the camera through her thick, wire-rimmed glasses. I was sweating now as I read the remaining documents in the St. Mary's file. Finally, exhausted and wet with perspiration, I walked to my car. That night, my dreams were filled with relatives, some I'd never met and some I'd known only briefly. In the dream, I drove an enormous old gas-guzzling res car filled with Mindamoyen, elder Ojibwe women. I wrestled the manual steering wheel, just barely keeping that car on the narrow reservation road as we headed towards an unknown destination. Tiny and wrinkled, the Mindamoyens sat sunk down, almost swallowed up in the car's worn upholstered seats. Wearing their gaily flowered house dresses, they gazed ahead serenely, unaware of my struggles with the steering wheel. Just like in real life, it was my job to drive the elders. They trusted me to deliver them safely. Towards the end of the dream, Uncle Hashi, his name was Hudson, who I barely knew, sang a hand drum song containing one word, Wabanong, repeated over and over. Later, I asked my Ojibwe linguist friend about the meaning of the word. He said it means to the east. I've been told that visions and directions about our lives can be found in the east. So, trusting Uncle Hashi's direction, I continued on. I called my Auntie Pat and asked if she'd tell me about my mother. She paused a bit but said, "Okay, come up and take me out to breakfast." She was waiting for me when I arrived. Her hair was freshly permed. Dressed neatly in her Kateri Society blazer, she reminded me of a plump little partridge holding court in her crowded reservation living room. "I'm going to tell you about your mom, but you got to promise not to tell her I was the one," she cautioned. She asked what I knew about my grandmother, my mother's mother, Cecilia. My mother would root her little rear end down into her chair and draw all 5 feet of herself up haughtily when she spoke rarely of Cecilia, or Seal, as they called her, her mother. "I never did like my mother," she would always say. Her voice was like a cat's hiss when she spat out that sentence so quickly that it sounded like a one-word curse. It was Seal who was to blame for my mother and her siblings' placement at the sister school. It was Seal who abandoned them. And it was Joe, my grandfather, the battered hero who rescued them. My mother would often tell the story of that last terrible fight between her parents that led to their split and the family's destruction. I remember that night. I was only 5 years old, but I remember. My father came home drunk, but he was always a happy-go-lucky drunk, and he came home singing that time. But my mother got mad. She was always mad, and hit him over the head with a beer bottle. He sank right down on the ground. I screamed and screamed and screamed. I thought she'd killed him. She would pinch her eyes shut and shake her hands vigorously, as though trying to rid herself of that clinging presence. She would wave me away if I tried to comfort her. After that, they broke up, and we went to live at the sister school. My mother's relatives were just like her. They never helped him, only criticized him. If they helped us kids, they lorded it over us. Pa was the only one who ever cared about me. He would come and get us from the sister school and try to take care of us, but they were always against him. They'd send us back. Pa would come visit us at the sister school. He brought us maple sugar candy from his sugar bush. He always called me his girl, my girl. We would pick berries with him so he could sell them. He'd fix a little bucket for me to fill. I'd get hungry and cry, but he'd pick leaves from a certain tree and make me tea so the hunger would go away. One time he owned a tavern, and he'd stand me up on the bar so I could sing all around the water tank for the people. His name was Joseph, and he was a carpenter, just like St. Joseph in the Bible. He was always thinking of ways to take care of us. Even after I got married, he would stay with us and fix our house. My mother visited us only once at the sister school. She brought me a 5-pound box of chocolates that time. I took them back to the girls' dorm, and I ate the whole box until I threw up. I never liked chocolates after that, and I never liked my mother. Seal died before I was born, and my mother did not attend her funeral. Occasionally, she repeated the story about her parents' last fight. She couldn't seem to stop herself, nor could she shake off the invisible presence that clung to her hands. After each telling, her attacks of anxiety grew longer and more sustained. She moved farther inward away from us, irritated that we wanted to help and enraged at our failure to understand. Auntie Pat, however, Seal's youngest sister, told me the whole story. Joe was quite a bit older than Seal. He was in the infantry in World War I, and after he came home, he was a terrible drunk. Violent and unpredictable, he would beat the hell out of Seal. In that last fight, he tackled Seal, punching and ripping her clothes. He began to bite into her. It was a terrible brawl. So much blood. I still can't believe it now when I tell it, but he chewed off one of her breasts. Your mother was there alone with them. She saw all of it. She must have been about 4 or 5 years old. Somehow Seal got away from him and hit him over the head with a beer bottle, knocking him out. She dragged herself over to our house. Your mom was just screaming and couldn't move. She stayed behind with Joe. Our ma was a midwife and she doctored her. After she got better, Seal didn't want to go back to Joe and her kids. Joe, you see, had turned into a Wendigo, that Ojibwe cannibal spirit, and he passed all that jimchi, that bad medicine, to Seal when he tried to devour her. Ma told her, even a bitch dog stays with its pups. But Seal had had enough. She left Bad River and later married a white guy. Ma tried to raise Seal's kids, but she still had 8 of us living at home. For Christ's sakes, Joe, give me a little money and I'll take care of the kids, she'd say to him. But he'd cuss and say he'd raise his own goddamn kids. So your mom and the other 4 kids ended up at the sister school. Every now and then, Joe would decide he was going to take care of them, and he'd take them out of the school. He sold home brew out of a shack for a while and made a little money, but the authorities closed him down because of smallpox. It didn't matter, though. He'd go off on another toot, and the kids would be back with the sisters, abandoned over and over again. Later, my cousin Mary Lou, Auntie Pat's eldest daughter, told me that Seal would sometimes return secretly to the reservation to pick medicines for an unknown ailment. As the eldest girl, it was Mary Lou's job to help her Auntie Seal gather the medicine. Sumac, toxic if not consumed carefully. During those times, Mary Lou would have to share her bed, the living room couch, with Seal. The devout Catholic, Seal would whisper the entire rosary every night into the darkness. Seal died of colon cancer at age 56. That slow-growing disease thrived on a lifetime of bad food and Grandpa Joe's Wendigo that had lodged deep in her guts. Several of my female relatives from that generation died from that same disease. Though Seal and her husband moved to Idaho, they brought her back to be buried in his family plot in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. Recently, I found her grave, weathered and crumbling. The markings on her headstone were worn, but still visible. I told all of this to a researcher friend recently who specializes in finding ways for children to overcome trauma. You know, she said, I think your mother was trying to wipe away her mother's blood when she would flap and wring her hands, she told me. Although the Wendigo devoured part of her sanity, somehow she saved enough of herself to raise a family. She was able to give us a gift that she could never have dreamed of as a child. She stayed. It was that Ojibwe blood that saved us. Its medicine outlasted the Wendigo and waited for us to know and forgive those stubborn women who dared to love us. Miigwech.